words middle class, you probably think of the suburbs, of family sitcoms, of owning a home and a sensible car, sending kids to college and yearly vacations, meaning some disposable income. Well, that picture that we have has been changing, and the middle class has been shrinking continuously as the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. You may have seen the headlines saying the middle class is dying or the middle class is being squeezed. It comes up all the time in politics, in media, and just society in general. It's a big topic because a lot of people exist in the middle class, and we know that people tend to care more about topics if it impacts them. But what really is the middle class? Are you even in it, and how is it changing? What I thought was pretty interesting is that a lot of people think that they're in the middle class. When people are asked to guess what class that they think they're in, they tend to be biased towards the middle. People in lower income tend to underestimate the cutoffs, and people with higher incomes tend to overestimate them. What that means is that even though 52% of the US population and 58% of the Canadian population are middle class, 70% of those people think they're middle class. There isn't one overarching definition of the middle class, but what tends to be agreed upon the most frequently is that it's anywhere between 75% and 200% of the country's median income. So in the US, where the median household income fell at about $67,000 in 2020, that means that the middle class income would be anywhere between $50,000 and $135,000. But we know these numbers don't mean a lot without more of an explanation, so let's keep going.
The middle class isn't gone, but it's changing. And basically what that means is that you're going to be less likely to fit into that cookie cutter mold of the middle class that's existed in the past. Something that we have to keep in mind as we're having this conversation is that you have no guarantee that having a certain salary is going to be able to provide you that house, the car, the vacation, and allow you to be able to retire soundly. Now, you might even still be doing those things, buying a car, a house, all those things to keep up with everyone around you, thinking that this salary means I'm entitled to all these things even though you can't really afford them. People in the middle class are realizing that their money doesn't go as far as they thought it would go, but they're going broke trying to maintain the facade of being in the middle class as they thought it would look. Spending money on entertainment, having a nice place to live, buying cars outside of their budget, and generally just going deeper into debt in order to look the part. For example, some people are making $60,000 a year, but living like what they think $60,000 should get them without actually doing the calculation for themselves. When you calculate the cost of essentials like housing, transportation, groceries, healthcare, all depending on where you live, of course, all of those necessary costs that are going up at a much quicker rate due to inflation than your salary is, what you'll notice is that you don't have mass amounts of money left over to do all the shopping that you think $60,000 should be able to get for you. The truth is, what a middle class salary looks like might really mean that after all of those essential expenses, you might have a little bit of money left over for those short-term savings, maybe to buy a home, and also for your long-term investing for your retirement and future you.
Okay guys, I'm jumping in with a quick example because at one point my salary was exactly $60,000, which is a solid middle-class income for a single person living in Toronto. At the time, I paid about $1,000 for rent, which I split, $300 for groceries, $100 on my phone, $100 for transportation, about $300 in other expenses for a total of $1,800. That left me about $2,000 left over to save and invest, which was a pretty good amount. But that was with a pretty tight budget and with low rent for a bigger city. If I had went out and bought clothes monthly, went on a lot of trips, paid for expensive dinners, had expensive subscriptions, did lots of gym classes, whatever it might have been, it could have been really easy to eat up a big portion of that $2,000. And it's really not about doing none of those things, it's just about not doing all of those things. You really have to be prioritizing the saving and investing piece, but a lot of people aren't doing that because this salary means that they should be able to buy these set of things.
The bottom line here is that people are going into debt to try and stay in the middle class. But why is it so hard to stay there? Why is it that our perception of what a middle class salary should be able to afford is so different from reality? And why are people with good salaries living paycheck to paycheck and not saving for their future?
There's a few reasons for this, but first let's take a look at the changes to the middle class and why they've happened. I mentioned before that 52% of Americans fall into the middle class, but if we take a look back at 1971, 61% of Americans were in the middle class at that time, so clearly it's getting smaller. Where are those people going? Interestingly enough, people are going pretty equally both to the lower class and the upper class as they leave the middle, so as much as some people are falling out, some are also moving up. If we focus in, one of the biggest reasons that's talked about is that salaries and income growth aren't keeping up with the pace of inflation. Now, we talked about inflation more in this video up here that we'll link for you somewhere in there, but in a super high level short form version, it's how much much prices are rising each year. So if prices are going up more than our salaries are going up, like if we only get a little 1% increase, but the price of everything rises by 3%, we obviously can't buy as much with our salaries this year. And the slowdown in salary increase really has had a big impact. We read in the New York Times that between the 1940s and the 1970s, in the US specifically, compensation rose at about the same rate as productivity. So if an employee's value grew by about 2%, then their salary would match that and grow by 2% as well. Today, that just doesn't happen. In 2017, a typical US worker would make $25.15, whereas they would have made $33.10 if this trend had continued. Why is that? One reason is definitely the tech boom and the rise of automation. For all of the people that were doing a job that was fairly straightforward, meaning follow this exact set of steps and this pretty similar procedure, those jobs just weren't as necessary when some tech could come over and take over those roles, so wage stopped growing as much. On the other side, upper class workers' wages have been growing at a much faster pace, which means that they're pulling away from the middle class in terms of how much they can buy. Now, another piece of this does go back to the 2008 recession, specifically when a lot of lower and middle income homes actually lost their jobs, lost their homes, but they also lost a lot in the market. At the same time, upper class people, despite also losing value in the market in the short term, they had the financial security and the funds and the income to hold those positions and let them recuperate over time, aka they didn't sell. In fact, they actually bought more and took advantage of the stock market prices being low. This means that their net worths have grown a lot as the economy have recovered, and they're at much higher rates now than they were even before 2008. Whereas middle income people have been recovering much more slowly, meaning that they still don't quite have the same median net worth, forget about higher, than they did pre-recession.
So something to keep in mind is that the upper class are still growing their incomes and their net worths at a much higher pace. From what we've seen, and it probably shouldn't be that surprising, they tend to have a lot more ownership and a lot more passive income sources, which allows them to be more financially secure. The middle class or the working class, on the other hand, these are the people that are actively earning the majority of their dollars. Now, something that me and Steph talk about all the time is that when people picture the upper class, they go straight to picturing the 1% or the 0.1% of people. So now with that in mind, according to Bloomberg, as of October 2021, America's middle class officially holds less wealth than America's top 1%. So not the entire upper class, but the top 1%. They say that the middle class holds about 26% of the wealth, with the 1% holding about 27% of the wealth. Crazy. Okay, so to paint an even better picture, the middle class is about 78 million families that make anywhere from $21,000 a year to $141,000 a year. The 1%, on the other hand, is 1.3 million families that make above $500,000 a year. And to give you an even more interesting stat, that same top 1% of people owns over half of the US's share of stocks. And on top of that, the top 10% of Americans, a solid portion of the upper class, owns a whopping 89% of all US stocks. Tell me that's not crazy. Now, obviously there's a lot of large scale problems with this, but what we want to focus on is how our collective view of the upper class, specifically our thinking that the upper class equals the 1%, can be really harmful. I mean, we're all out here watching shows like Billions, Entourage, Succession, Gossip Girl, and the list could keep going on, but we're doing this as a means of escapism. What we don't realize though is that as we're watching these shows, everything that we're taking from it seeps into our lives when we start thinking that we need all these luxuries and all these extravagant things that these people have. For a lot of people, you're no longer striving to be in the middle class or the upper class with financial and home security, but you're now striving to be the uber rich with all the wants in the world. Now this leads me to the point that there is so much more to the middle class than just your income level, which is pretty much the definition that we've been going off of so far. Who you're surrounded by and what you consume has a really big impact on what you do with that income. For some, it's spending to keep up with their peers who seem like they have it all when really they probably can't afford it either. It can also be tough watching YouTube videos on this topic like you're doing right now, because sometimes it can be deceiving. For example, a lot of the financial YouTubers talk about the middle class like they're a part of it, when they're likely in the upper class or maybe even the 1%, depending on who they are themselves.
Now, I'm not a billionaire, nor do I have a billion-dollar company, and you probably don't either.
This can also fuel the idea that they're just like me, yet they seem to spend so much more money than me. Should I be doing that too? Honestly, this is why we think it's important to calculate where you fall and keep that in mind. Not because it defines you, but because it outlines what you can actually afford to spend.
So what does all of this even mean? What can we do about all this stuff and this info and the upper class, the middle class? Well, obviously for major trending changes to happen to the middle class overall, there'll probably have to be some interventions put in place, like the polarizing topic of taxing the rich, which we actually want to do a full video about soon. So if it's already up, we'll have it linked somewhere for you. And if not, make sure you subscribe to see it. Obviously, if the upper class were taxed at a higher rate, as they used to be, that means that the government would have more money to end up funding services and programs that benefit the middle class, or it could just simply reduce taxes on the middle class. But what can people actually do themselves right now besides sit around waiting for different tax policy and programs to change? Well, one is to change our views on consumption. Always wanting to spend more, buy more, the easy access to consumer debt, those are all a huge part of the issue. And if you now know that you've fallen into it, then hopefully it's on you to also pull yourself out of that part of it. We read an article that said a good thing to focus on for the middle class would be more so sustainability, meaning having a more financially well-balanced quality of life. Instead of always wanting more and having to work harder and longer hours just to get that more, instead focus more on the long term. Maybe instead of our houses continuously getting bigger and bigger and our cars always being brand new, instead we can focus more on the ability to just have a home and transportation, to be able to have emergency funds and not stress too much about unexpected costs, to invest for our retirement and actually take a breather from work, and maybe that trade-off will be worth it.
Okay, so the last thought we had on this is around home ownership. Obviously, owning real estate has been one of those tools, especially historically, that's built a lot of wealth in the form of acquiring assets. And this is obviously something that we've talked about a lot on this channel in previous videos. But something to keep in mind is that we're also living in a time where there's this blind addiction to home ownership, aka people buying homes that they can't really afford. Buying the right home at the right price is obviously great, but what you don't want to do is become house poor or buy something that's unaffordable long term in an overvalued market. This is obviously an even bigger topic that we can dive into on a different day, but just like everything else, there's always something that you can take away or think on. Overall, the middle class is not dying. There still is and will be for the foreseeable future a middle class, but it is changing. Anyways, we hope that you liked our breakdown on this topic, and as usual, we do want to hear what your thoughts are on the middle class, maybe on the upper class, down in the comment box below. Our next video is going to be super exciting. It's going to be breaking down the panic buying that happened in 2020 and what's been the impact since then. As usual, make sure you stay tuned for that. Make sure you show us some love down below with a like. Make sure you're subscribed right there, and if you haven't seen any of our previous videos, make sure you check them out next door. We will be back. You know the vibes. Let's go.